Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here because it is the end of July, which means it's time to wrap up the month in reading. This was actually a really good month. I kind of struggled a bit earlier in the year. I had hernia surgery in February, which meant I didn't really read anything. And then when quarantine hit and lockdown and all of that, I managed to keep going, but had to kind of struggle my way through it. A lot of the reading this month came naturally, which was really nice and a kind of a relief. I'm very much hoping that I can keep this momentum as I head into August. I actually managed to read, let's count, I have my Goodreads over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 books in the month of July. I don't have the receipts in front of me, but I believe that is my best reading month yet in 2020. And I read some really good books. There were, a couple of little clunkers. There was one DNF, which I'm including in there because I made it 3/4 of the way through the book. It's just that last part that I didn't finish, but we'll get to that one. So let's start. The first book I finished in the month of July was actually an audiobook, so I don't have a physical copy of it, but I listened to Know My Name by Chanel Miller, and it was really wonderful. It's a very difficult book, but I feel like it's a very essential book as well. If you're unfamiliar with the book, Chanel Miller was the other half of the Brock Turner case. If you're familiar with Brock Turner, he had sexually assaulted a woman, was caught in the act in front of a dumpster, and throughout the trial, the woman was only known as Jane Doe, but she came out as Chanel Miller when this book was released, and she talks about her experience, a little bit about her life in the beginning and about the night in question, but mostly about her life after the incident and how her life was altered forever and the very hard road to getting her life back on track. She had to take a break from work, and part of that was because the trial date kept moving, so she was afraid of getting a job and then having to take so much time off and then having to keep changing the date that she was requesting off because the trial date kept moving around. It was very fluid, but also about how badly she was treated by law enforcement and by the legal world as a victim. And of course, she also talks a lot about the word victim and its use, and I will leave that discussion to her because I think she talks about it much more intelligently than I ever could. I'm using the word here because it seems like the easiest thing to do for people to understand and relate to, but that's part of the whole conversation. It's like we use this shorthand, but she talks about it way more eloquently than I would, so I would definitely recommend checking that out. And at every turn, even the night of the incident, when she wakes up in the hospital with no clear memory of what happened, she is treated like a suspect, like someone who needs to be interrogated and blamed for what happened, while Brock Turner himself is given leeway, is given understanding, is given patience and respectability. And at every stage in the process, she is not treated that way. And this may sound familiar. It's a conversation that people tend to have about issues like this. But it's one thing to hear it and another thing to hear specific examples of it at play. And it's very disturbing. The book culminates with the sentencing trial for Brock Turner. He was found guilty, in which she wrote a victim statement asking for him to be sentenced, and the judge basically chastised her for it. In that statement, she talked about why Brock Turner's apology did not really hold any weight because he was only really doing it because he had been found guilty, and even then he kept making excuses, which showed that he didn't really mean it. It's an incredibly eloquent, angry, justifiably angry victim statement, and the judge chastised her for not just accepting the apology, and famously only sentenced Brock Turner to a very ridiculously light sentence, which amounted to a slap on the wrist for what he did. And from there, someone asked to publish her victim statement, and it blew up and became viral and led to all of this. It's such a good book. I would definitely recommend it. It's painful, it's upsetting, but it's a conversation that I think really needs to be had, and Chanel Miller does it very eloquently, so I would absolutely recommend this book as well. She reads the audiobook, and she does a very good job. That is how I listened to it, or how I read it. So that was the first book that I finished in the month of July. The next book was not as successful, and I still kind of grapple with this one. It's the end of Eddy. The glare from the window is kind of making it difficult to see. So I hope you can see. This is by Édouard Louis. I had been really eager to read this book for about a year and finally got around to it. It was kind of a holdover from my LGBTQ reading in the month of June. As if you remember, I prioritized books by or about Black queer stories in the month of June. This was something that had been on my TBR originally and got bumped, so I managed to fit it in the month of July instead. And the interesting thing about this is it really blurs the line between fiction and nonfiction. It is inspired by Édouard Louis' life. From all accounts that I've seen, it is basically his life. So you start to wonder why he didn't just write a memoir. And I guess doing it this way allows him a little bit of anonymity, allows him to maybe change some of the details if he wants. But it's unclear, to me at least, how much of this is altered from his actual life story. So it's about him growing up in a village in northern France, which is kind of like, in America we would call it like a blue-collar area, and the struggles that he had growing up gay and being bullied very badly. And a lot of the depictions of his being bullied, it could be triggering, so if that's a thing for you, please be warned. The interesting thing about it is that at no point did I really feel caught up in the story. At no point did I really feel engaged or like I was enjoying it. I mean, it's hard to say enjoy because it's a very difficult story. So it's not like something, it's kind of similar to Chanel Miller. It's not a story that you really enjoy per se, but I just never felt caught up or really captivated. But there are things about it that I liked. And it's kind of an unpleasant book to read. And I've been interrogating that ever since, because of course does a story have to be pleasant for it to be good? And especially since it does blur the line between fiction and nonfiction, this is likely what happened to him. And a lot of the bullying aspects are familiar with my experience growing up. It's a very true story, and I like that the book does not sugarcoat what happens to him and his feelings about it and the way his family approaches him. Because I think it is also, especially now, easy to think of coming out stories as kind of positive because we're kind of getting used to that, which is good. That's a good thing. But I think it's important to remember that coming out stories were very fraught for most of history and continue to be in many parts of the world and in many families. So I like that the book has that spin. I just didn't love it as much as I wanted to. It's a slim little volume, so I would recommend checking it out. This is, by the way, translated from the French by Michael Lucy. It's published by Picador. And I am interested in reading other things by Édouard Louis. This was my first. I wonder if those would be different experiences. I just think it's a difficult book, which is its intention, so it's hard to fault it for that. But that's what it is. That's kind of where we get left. The next book that I finished in the month of July, sorry, I had to move a little bit to try to block the glare from the window. The next book that I finished in the month of July was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, is what I'm trying to say. And I've talked about this book a lot on my channel. I did a standalone review of it. I will link that down below. This was a buddy read with Lindsay from Lindsay's Book Life, and I definitely recommend doing a buddy read or a book club of this if you can. I think there's a lot of really interesting conversations. One thing that I actually just responded to a comment about today was that somebody, and I'm blanking on the name, had commented to say that they didn't like it because it has so many unlikable characters. And to me, that's actually one of the things that's so good about this book. And I probably wouldn't use the word unlikable. I would say this book has very complicated characters. So say Yaz, who's a teenager, is at once fierce and really smart and also completely oblivious in the way that a lot of teenagers can be about the world, especially privileged teenagers, which, like it or not, to her, is what she is. And I think the book gives its characters leeway to be like that. And to me, it's kind of reflective of the real world because we are complicated. We have good sides and bad sides. You know, it's easy. You don't get to see the full range of me in the videos that I present, but I can be lazy. I can be stubborn. I have a lot of bad qualities. You see me talking about books and being cheerful. That's not the way it always is. I've talked to my foster son. I'm sure he has many things that he could point out to you that would be problematic about me. But Bernardine Evaristo gives these characters enough room to be full and layered, and I thought that was really fascinating. I really love this book. Like I said, I have a full review of it, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. This was the co-winner of the Booker Prize last year, and I have not read The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, but to me it seems like this is the one that really should have just been the winner. It should have just been Girl, Woman, Other for Bernardine Evaristo. We'll see if the dogs are going to start barking. And when I say dogs, I mean Jamie. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for Girl, Woman, Other. The next one was kind of a gimme book. I've talked about Sue Grafton a fair amount on the channel. She is kind of my go-to mystery thriller series when I need like a pick-me-up or something kind of easy that I'm going to be able to get through quickly. So I have been rereading the series ever since Sue Grafton died, and I had not actually finished the series by the time she died, but I felt like that was a good excuse to go back to the beginning and work my way through. So I've already done A, B, C, and D, and I did a video about those books, which I will also link down below. Now I've read E, and I need to get to F, and so I can do another video in the series. I remembered not liking this one, and in fact, it had a low rating on Goodreads from me, but I actually enjoyed it the second time around, and I'm looking forward to reading more books in my reread of the Sue Grafton, Kinsey Milhone series. Next, I finished, actually, next is the DNF. I skipped over it inadvertently because I don't have a physical copy of it. I actually, it would have been before E is for Evidence. It's Something That May Shock and Discredit You by Daniel Mallory Ortberg. This book is kind of hard to pin down because it's kind of a memoir, kind of an essay collection. There are a lot of observations on pop culture. There's a lot of discussion of Daniel himself and his identity, his gender identity as a transgender person. And I wanted to like this book a lot. I'd heard really good things about it, but ultimately, and I feel weird saying this about an essay collection, because that ultimately is kind of what it is, but it feels a little bit scattered and like there isn't much of a point. But what really got me at the end was that there are all of these interludes. There's a specific name for them, and I can't remember what they were called. But they're these kind of interludes where something allegedly clever, and that sounds really mean, allegedly clever, but a lot of it is clever, but it goes on for too long. That's the thing. So, for instance, in one of the interludes, he is imagining an episode of House Hunters where there's a lot of fighting between the couple, and the husband is being kind of stereotypically kind of borderline abusive, and the wife is being kind of meek, and the realtor is being like a stereotypical realtor. And it's kind of amusing for a page or two, but it keeps going and dragging out, and it's kind of to the point where I didn't find it clever anymore. And that happens a lot. There are a lot of those things. There's a lot of play with the Bible, which I'm not familiar with. I've never read the Bible. I've only read Bible stories. Well, my grandmother read Bible stories to me as bedtime stories. And fun fact about me, I did not think they were supposed to be anything different than the fairy tales that were often read to me as bedtime stories. So, oops. It was only when I was older that I was like, oh, that was supposed to be real. Okay, whoops. So, anyway. Neither here nor there. But so there's a lot to do with the Bible, and that's kind of interesting, but then it kind of interprets parts of the Bible, really goes in hard on them. So ultimately, I just didn't feel connected to this book, and kind of felt actively irritated by the parts that really dragged on. So I ultimately DNF'd it. And that's where we are with that. But I did get 3/4 of the way through, so I do feel confident rating it and discussing it, and that's exactly what I'm doing right here. And then we get to Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane, which I talked about a little bit in a previous Friday Reads, which I will link down below. I really liked this book, and I'm hoping that more people will discover this, because I don't think I've seen a lot of conversation about this on the internet space, and certainly not here on BookTube. A couple people commented that they had also read it. It's very possible that this just ticks a bunch of boxes for me because it has a complicated family, it deals with addiction, and there's a mother who's kind of a little bit crazy. Not a little bit, she's crazy. And it really is about two things at once. It's about the folly of thinking that the past doesn't matter, but it's also about the folly of thinking that the past defines you, because it will only do that if you allow it to. And I really enjoyed it. It's going to be up there on my favorites of the year when we get to the end. So that's Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane. After that, I actually listened to Unearthed Were Briefly Gorgeous on audio, but I have a copy of the book itself. This is by Vuong, and I talked about that in the same Friday Reads where I talked about Ask Again Yes, which I will link down below. And I kind of struggled with this. There are a lot of aspects that I liked, but I felt like it became muddied by a little bit of too muchness. There have been a lot of really interesting comments back and forth about that book since I talked about it. Some people saying that's kind of the point because it's a little bit about his life. This is another thing that kind of blurs the line between fiction and nonfiction because it's very much inspired by Vuong's life. And so there's an interesting conversation to be had here. Ultimately, I just didn't really enjoy the book. So that's kind of where I ended on that. There are the writing is great. There are a lot of things I did like about this book. It's just kind of in the middle ground for me. And that is Unearthed Were Briefly Gorgeous by Vuong. Now we get to Later, My Life at the Edge of the World by Paul Lisicky. So this is a memoir, and when I talked about this in the Friday Reads, I was only halfway through it. And I said it was kind of in the same boat as Unearthed Were Briefly Gorgeous. There are parts of it that I liked, but there were parts that I didn't. This built more in the last half to become something that I really liked the beginning, and then it kind of lost me a little bit in the middle to the point where I was wondering which direction it was going to go. By the end, it came back a little bit. So this is a memoir of Paul Lisicky. He was accepted to a writing program, kind of like a fellowship in Provincetown in, I think it was 1992. And he is at a point in his life where he is coming into his own as an adult. He is also coming out, but life at that time is in the shadow of the AIDS epidemic, and AIDS is still very much a concern. A lot of people he meets in Provincetown at the time are living with AIDS and dying of AIDS because at that time it was not very treatable. So it's about the fear or the dueling nature of him discovering his sexuality and accepting his sexuality at a time when sex itself was very dangerous. And it's interesting because at the end it moves a little bit to the present when he and I will talk about his relationship a little bit more when I talk about the next book, but he is now suddenly single again and dating, and the different experience of this Provincetown 1991, 1992, that era, and now when there is not only is AIDS treatable so that you can live with HIV and manage your health care for a very long time, but you have Truvada or PrEP, which can actively prevent the spread of it. I wish it had gone in a little harder on the end, because that dynamic, the difference between being single at the early stages and then being single now, is really interesting. And I kind of wanted a little bit more of like a bow on that, but it's weird to ask for more of a book, especially when I criticize two other books for giving me too much, but hey. So ultimately I enjoyed this. There are parts that I didn't like, parts that felt a little bit muddied. He has the writing style of it's a little poetic at times, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. There are chapters, but each chapter has little divisions in it. Sometimes they are as short as a single paragraph. Sometimes they go for a couple of pages. And sometimes, like here's one and then there's another. Sometimes it feels like they're almost standalone and they don't necessarily connect to the rest of the novel. Sometimes they feel great. Sometimes it feels like the narrative is a little bit disconnected. But I think that's ultimately the point of the book. So ultimately I did kind of enjoy this. Now what's interesting about this book is that it formed the bridge to the next book, because Paul Lisicky had a writing fellowship in Provincetown where he lived for many years, and it kind of set the stage for me to read what I'm about to talk about. So for my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge, which is my reading goal for 2020, I want to read a poetry collection. And because I don't engage with poetry, I very much struggle with it. So my Alexandria, Poems by Mark Doty, was recommended to me earlier this year by, I want to say, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse and Sean the Book Maniac. So I picked it up because it seems like something that ticks my boxes. That's kind of how I'm approaching a lot of my Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge. I'm trying to find something that fits in with me as a reader, and then something that will get outside of that a little bit. Even just the fact that it's a genre I don't typically read is outside my comfort zone, but trying to stay within my wheelhouse and then getting out of the wheelhouse a little bit. So this is the one that stayed in. So the reason these are connected is that Mark Doty actually factors into this book. He's not named per se, but there is a Mark in later who is in a relationship with a man who is dying of AIDS named Wally, and later is in a relationship with Paul. The book later does not discuss the relationship at all, except to say that they dated for a long time and then eventually broke up. And that's Mark Doty. And what's interesting as well is that this collection was published in 1992 or 1993. So it's published in the same time period, and Mark Doty lived in the Provincetown as well, and it's dedicated to Wally, who is actually more of a character in later, and I say character, but it's a memoir, so it's a real person. He appears more than Mark in later. So it's for Wally. Later actually inspired me to pick this up and finally get to it as part of my project. I've really been putting off poetry because poetry scares me. I'm really intimidated by poetry. I always feel like I don't get it. This very much deals with kind of LGBTQ life, but also a little bit AIDS. AIDS is not really specifically named anywhere in there. A lot of the poems in here worry about illness and contracting illness and whether or not illness is already inside of you. And it deals with death and dying and grief and absence a lot throughout the collection. It is only about 87 pages. So I read this morning, actually, and I got up very early because Jamie, the dog that's usually barking, decided she wanted to get up at 5:30 a.m. and go outside and have breakfast. So I did not get back to sleep. So I read this in a single morning. And I really like the way it talks about death and absence and how the body kind of degrades over time. Anyway, there are a lot of really beautiful passages in here. There are things that I fear I did not quite understand. Like there is one poem in particular that I'm kind of skimming through and looking for, where it's not named, but it seems pretty clear he's talking about the AIDS quilt. Okay, I found it. So it is in the poem, which is entitled "The Wings." In the exhibition hall, each unfurled 3x5 field bears in awkward or accomplished embroidery a name, every banner stitched to another and another. They're reading the unthinkable catalog of the names, so many they blur, become a single music pronounced with difficulty over the microphone, become a pronoun, become you. It's the clothing I can't get past, the way a favorite pair of jeans, a striped shirt's sewn into the cloth, the fading, the pulls in the fabric demonstrate how these relics formed around one essential missing body. An empty pair of pants is mortality's severest evidence. Embroidered mottos blend into something elegiac but removed. A shirt can't be remote. One can't look past the sleeves where two arms were, where a shoulder pushed against a seam, and someone knew exactly how the stitches pressed against skin that can't be generalized but was irretrievably you or yours. And I loved that. I thought it was beautiful and sad and heartbreaking. Like I said, there are parts of it that I didn't quite understand, or I'm not quite sure I understood, but most of it really did speak to me, especially since this time period where the book was published is around the time my father came out of the closet. And he mentions a bus in San Francisco on Potrero Hill. Well, I lived on Potrero Hill in San Francisco. That's where I went to high school. Not on Potrero Hill, but that's where we lived when I went to high school. And he mentions a bus that I used to take, and that's kind of it. Just this idea, and this goes for later as well, of kind of discovering your sexuality in this time really speaks to me, because that is kind of, once my father came out of the closet in this era, I made sense to myself and was starting to figure out that I am gay, and I was discovering that part of myself in the same time. And I remember, because we eventually moved to San Francisco, you know, AIDS and HIV was still very much a concern for people, and I met people who were living with AIDS and HIV at the time. So even though I technically should have missed a lot of this period in gay history, it actually was part of my own formative process of heading into adolescence and then heading into adulthood and kind of reckoning with all of these things. So both books really hit that part of my heart and my past, but this one in particular. And I'm really glad that I'm doing this Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge, because it has definitely challenged a lot of my perceptions about things, genres that I don't read, and shown that there are definitely ways in which I can engage with them. I am actually really looking forward to trying another volume of poetry, which seems really shocking, because this is the genre that I was the least excited about when it comes to the Read Outside Your Comfort Zone challenge. And here I am looking for more. So I'm going to go back through. I got a bunch of recommendations that I'm going to be going through. If you have others, please leave them down below. I know Mark Doty has other collections, but I want to try something a little bit more out of my wheelhouse. So I have some recommendations that I will be checking out, but if you have more, please leave them down below, because I'm very much looking forward to more poetry, which is a sentence I never thought I would say. And here we are. 2020 is a wild year. Wild. Now, I am halfway through Deacon King Kong by James McBride, but there's no way I'm going to be finishing this before the end of the month, which is why I'm doing my July wrap-up now. This is something that's going to have to carry over into August, and I will talk more about it as I get it, as I finish it. And I will say I'm enjoying it so far, but I have a lot more thoughts that I will be getting to about it. This weekend, I am starting my buddy read of Blonde by Joyce Carol Oates. This is something that has been on my TBR for a very, very long time. It is a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It was published, I can't remember off the top of my head what book won the Pulitzer this year. It's copyright the year 2000. I think it was Interpreter of Maladies. If I'm wrong, I'll put that here. But I believe it was Interpreter of Maladies that beat this. Hang on, I'm just gonna check. I was wrong. Interpreter of Maladies was the year before, and Blonde lost to The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. I was going to say I will probably read Interpreter of Maladies to do a full wrap-up on the Pulitzer Prize year that year, but I'm not going to get to The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by the end of the year. So scrap that idea. But I am glad that I'm going to finally be getting around to reading this book. I know Joyce Carol Oates is someone who's... I've read 3 of her books, liked all of them, and am very eager to read more of, especially since you hear a lot about Joyce Carol Oates from Eric Carl Anderson, and it kind of did bring this book up a little bit more. There's also a movie adaptation that was supposed to be released this year. Who knows if that'll happen, because 2020, as discussed, is a wild year. Anyway, this will be a buddy read with Britta Bowler, and I'm really looking forward to getting started on that. That will be this weekend, and it will be a project for August. I am also going to be in the final round of the BookTube Prize, which should be launching this weekend as well. I'm going to be on the nonfiction side, and that will be 6 books. I don't know what books are going to make the finale. Possibly there will be ones that I have already read. We'll have to see, because at the time I'm filming this, we don't have the results from the current round. So that's my reading month for July. That's what I'm working on now, and a little bit heading into August. It's not exactly a TBR for August, but I'm not going to be working on a TBR until I know what I'm looking at for the BookTube Prize. But I'd love to hear what you thought of any of these books. If you have recommendations based on these, like I said, if you have anything specifically for poetry, I am accepting recommendations. I need to go back and look at the list of other things that people have sent me in the past. And that's it for this wrap-up. Very excited for August. I'm hoping this momentum will carry forward into August, and that there will be a lot of good reads in that month as well. As always, I really appreciate your time. It is just amazing to me that anybody follows along at all. But if you do, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. And I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.